Hey, what's up coders, hope you are doing well. Today we are learning how to create a modal from scratch with HTML, CSS and JavaScript. A modal is this pop-up box usually positioned on top of everything else in the document, and it is used to attract the user's attention to some special information or to ask the user to do something, for example to register or log in without navigating to another page. It is a commonly used component in websites, and that's why I thought it would be a good idea to implement it from scratch as an alternative to using some third-party library or framework for this purpose. I hope you guys will enjoy this video and get some value out of it. Don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and without further ado, let's go! Okay, starting with an empty project in our editor, I'm using the Visual Studio Code editor. Let's create the index.html, style.css, and main.js files. In our project folder, in the index.html file, I type exclamation marks as emmet abbreviation. VS Code comes with the emmet plugin embedded, and if I hit tab or enter, we get some HTML5 boilerplate code. Let's insert the title, modals, and link the external files to the document. First, the style sheet. Here we are, and the JavaScript file. Notice that instead of placing the script in the body right above the closing body tag, I placed it in the head using the defer attribute. And we can now proceed to defining the body markup. For starters, let's add a modal triggering button. So upon a click event over this button, the modal will pop up. Other common modal triggering events would be on page load, or while scrolling, or on mouse move, or when the user is about to leave the page, etc. And now let's create the modal. I usually like placing the modals at the end of the page before the closing body tag. Of course, in this case, we don't have much content, but even if we did, I would still keep all page modals together towards the end of the page after the main content. Now, regarding the markup for the modal, we have a div with the class modal. This will actually be the background overlay, and it will contain a div with the class modal content, which will be the actual modal box. And in here goes the content for the modal. We could, for example, follow the Bootstrap framework structure by separating modal content into modal header, modal body, and modal footer. However, let's keep things even more basic and generic and flexible by simply adding all content in here without separating it into sections. So let's add an H1 heading with the title, modal title, and a few paragraphs with lorem ipsum text. Very nice. And let's add a few more words to the second paragraph, lorem, and let's say 10 more words. And finally, let's add a close button. Let's place it here, although it doesn't really matter since it will eventually be absolutely positioned relative to the modal content. I'll be using a span element instead of a button with the class modal close. And instead of using the letter X here, which depends on the font family and the lines might not be exactly perpendicular, let's use the character entity representing the multiplication sign. And that's all regarding the markup for the modal. So we have a div with the class modal, which is actually the background overlay containing a div with the class modal content, which is the actual modal box with some content. Okay, now let's open the project in the browser. For this purpose, I'm using the live server, which is a Visual Studio Code extension and allows for live reloading. So this is what we've created up to this point, and let's proceed to styling with CSS. For starters, I will paste some basic styling not related to the modal in order to save some time. So we are importing the Montserrat font family, resetting margin and padding to 0 and box sizing to border box for all elements, setting font family background color and color for the body, and some basic styling for the button, setting margin and padding and cursor to pointer. So if we save, this is what we get, and let's proceed to styling the modal. Starting with the modal background overlay, let's first define background color so that we can easily see what's happening, and let's set it to RGBA 000, and if we set opacity to 1, then we get a solid black color, but let's set it to 0.5, making it semi-transparent. Now we want the background overlay to cover the entire viewport, so let's set position to fixed relative to the viewport, starting from the top left corner and expanding to the entire viewport width and height. And by the way, the reason we used a fixed position for the modal instead of absolute is so that it always remains visible even in case of page scrolling. So if we set position to absolute for the modal and let's set a minimum height for the body to 200% of viewport height, we can see that on page scroll, modal is also moving. However, if we set position to fixed, we can see that modal always remains visible. Although we could also disable page scrolling by setting overflow to hidden for the body when modal is displayed, and we probably will do this later with JavaScript. Now let's also define a Z index in order to ensure that modal sits on top of other content. Z index could be 1 or 10 or 1000, depending on what other Z index values exist in our page. Let's also set overflow to auto in order to enable scrolling if needed, although this is not really necessary since we are going to take care of overflow in modal content. And finally, we will use flexbox in order to position the modal content. For this purpose, we will set the display property to flex for the modal. Of course, eventually we will set display property to none, and we will use JavaScript in order to set it to flex whenever the modal is triggered. In order to horizontally center the modal content, let's set justify content to center. Of course, this will become more obvious once we define dimensions for the modal content, which is actually the modal box. And in order to vertically align the modal content, we will use the align items property. And if, for example, we wanted to center it, we would set it to center. But let's set it to flex start instead in order to align it at the top of the container. Okay, now let's proceed to styling the modal box, the modal content. And let's start by setting background color to white. Next, let's set width to 60% of its parent element's width, which in this case coincides with viewport's width. Instead of fixing the height, let's set a maximum height to 75%. Let's also add some margin, and let's set it to 2 rem, and some padding. again to rem. And let's also round the corners a bit by setting border radius to 0.25 rem. Let's also add box shadow with 0 pixels horizontal offset, 4 pixels vertical offset, 20 pixels blur radius. So if, for example, this was 0, this is what we would get. And this is the color. If, for example, we set opacity to 1, then we would get a solid black color, and therefore box shadow would be more intense. And finally, let's set overflow to auto so that scrolling will be enabled in case of content overflow. So if I zoom in, initially height will increase until we reach the maximum height, which is 75%. And from that point on, we will get a scroll bar. If we didn't set overflow to auto, then overflowing content would expand beyond the boundaries of the box, since the default value for overflow is visible. Okay, we are actually done with styling the modal box. Let me paste some basic internal styling for the H1 heading and the paragraphs. Nice, and let's proceed to styling the modal close button. For starters, we will absolutely position it relative to modal content. To the top right corner of modal content. And let's increase font size to 1.75 rem. And let's set font weight to bold. Let's also set padding to 0 for top and bottom and 0.75 rem for left and right. Color will be black with low opacity, let's say 0.2. Cursor will be pointer. And let's also set user select to none in order to make it unselectable, since we are only interested in clicking the button and not selecting it. And finally, on modal close button, hover and focus. Let's change color by slightly increasing opacity to 0.5. Okay, I think we are done with CSS styling for now, but let's also add some very basic responsiveness for smaller screens. I will just paste this part in order to save some time. I will of course include a link in the description to this project in case you want to have a closer look. And now let's set the display property of modal to none instead of flex, and we will use JavaScript in order to show or hide the modal. So let's proceed to JavaScript. For starters, let's store the involved elements into variables for easier access. First, the modal trigger button. Since we currently only have one button element, this should be okay for now. However, later we will be a bit more specific. And similarly, we get the modal and modal close button elements and store them into the corresponding variables. Next, we will add an event listener for a click event over the modal trigger button element. And whenever the modal trigger button is clicked, the following anonymous function will be executed, and let's use arrow function notation. And in this case, we want to set the modal display property to flex. Let's save and check the result. Indeed, on button click, modal is displayed, and we could also remove page scrolling while modal is being displayed by setting the overflow property for the body to hidden. Let's do this. And now page scrolling is not available while modal is being displayed. Okay, now let's handle the modal close button click event. In this case, we want to close the modal and set the overflow property for the body back to its default value. In other words, we want to do the opposite things by setting the display property for the modal to none and the overflow property for the body to initial. Okay, let's check the result. By clicking on the modal trigger button, modal is displayed and body overflow is set to hidden. And by clicking on the modal close button, modal is hidden and body overflow is set back to its default value, which is visible. Excellent, we can now open and close the modal. Next step is to also be able to close the modal upon a click over the background overlay and not the modal box itself. But first, in order to avoid repeating stuff, let's create a function called toggle modal, which will be responsible for opening or closing the modal. So in here we first want to check whether the modal is currently open and in this case close it. One way to do this would be by checking whether its display property is set to flex. So let's use the getComputedStyle method, which is a window object method. However, this part is implied, so we can ignore it, for the modal, and we are interested in the display property. And if this value is equal to flex, this means that modal is currently open and therefore we want to close or hide it. So let's copy the code related to closing the modal and paste it in here. Else, in this case, the modal is currently closed and therefore we want to open it. So let's copy the code related to opening the modal and paste it in here. And we can now replace this part with a call to the toggle modal function. And similarly for this part. And we could even remove the brackets now since they are not necessary. Okay, and let's make sure that we didn't break anything and everything still works as intended. So we can still open the modal by clicking on the modal trigger button, and we can close the modal by clicking on the modal close button. Nice. Now let's also make it possible to dismiss or close the modal by clicking on the modal background overlay. For this purpose, we will add an event listener over the modal element for a click event, and whenever there is a click event, the toggle modal function will be called. However, this is not exactly correct yet, and let me show you what I mean. So, by clicking on the background overlay, indeed modal goes away. However, it also goes away by clicking on the modal box. And this is happening due to event bubbling, since despite the fact that event was initiated on the modal box, the modal content, it will move up the DOM hierarchy eventually triggering the event attached to the modal element. So, before calling the toggle modal function, we somehow want to ensure that the click event actually occurred over the background overlay. One way to do this would be by checking whether the event target, which is the element that was actually clicked, contains the class modal. And let's check the result. Clicking on the background overlay closes the modal, but clicking on the modal box does not close the modal, so it works. Another way to do this would be by checking whether event.currentTarget, which always refers to the element on which the event listener is attached to, is equal to event.target. And let's put this into one line in order to save some space and check the result. Indeed, by clicking on the modal backdrop, the background overlay modal goes away. However, nothing happens when clicking on the modal box, so everything works as intended. Okay, by now we have a functioning basic modal. What's next? Well, instead of instantly opening and closing the modal, we could smoothen the experience by animating it. So let's do this. Back to our CSS. And now, theoretically, one way we could go about this would be by using transitions. For example, changing opacity from 0 to 1 and vice versa. However, we cannot do this since we are changing the display property. So we will use CSS animations instead. And more specifically, we will bind animations to specific classes and add or remove these classes accordingly in order to get the desired result. For example, by adding the modal show class over the modal element, the element with the class modal, the following animation will take place. Let's name the animation fade in. We will specify the keyframes for the animation in a bit. Animation duration will be 0.5 seconds. Animation timing function is in out. We will not set delay, iteration count and direction. And animation fill mode will be set to forwards in order to retain the style values set by the last keyframe. And let's specify the keyframes for the fade in animation, and this is, I suppose, as simple as it gets. Starting with opacity 0, we want to end up with opacity 1. And all that remains now in order for the modal to fade in is to use JavaScript in order to add the modal show class to the modal whenever the modal is about to be displayed. So back to our JavaScript file, this is the part where we want to open the modal, and additionally to setting its display property to flex, let's add the modal show class. Okay, let's check the result. Indeed, by clicking on the modal trigger button, we get the fade in animation, and similarly we could add an exit animation. So let's move back to our CSS file and define the modal hide class, which will trigger the fade out animation, and let's keep this animation a bit shorter whenever added to the modal element. And let's specify the keyframes for the fade out animation. This time we want to start with opacity 1 and end up with opacity 0. Now back to our JavaScript file. This is the part where we want to close the modal. So here's where we will add the modal hide class. However, this way Modal will close instantly since we are also setting the display property to none. So we should add a small delay before executing these lines of code. We can do this using the setTimeout function. Delay will be 200 milliseconds since this is the duration of the fade out animation. And let's also not forget to remove the animation related classes so that we can add them again and so on. And let's see the result. Indeed, Modal fades in and out. Now we could also specifically target and animate the modal box, and let's quickly do this. Back to our CSS file. I will copy this part since we are going to work in a similar manner and paste it over here right below the modal content element styling. And now whenever the modal show class is added to the modal element, the following animation will also take place over the modal content element, which is the modal box. Let's name the animation fade in down. We will specify the keyframes for the animation in a bit. Let's keep everything else the same. Notice that we didn't add any new class since the presence of the modal show class, or addition of the modal show class should I say, is enough to trigger both animations, the one related to the modal as well as the one related to the modal content. And similarly, whenever the modal height class is added to the modal element, the fade out up animation will be applied to the modal box, the modal content. Now let's specify the keyframes first for the fade in down animation, and initially we set the opacity for the modal box to 0, and we also want to slightly pull it up by using the translate y CSS function over the transform property. So let's pull it up by 3 rem, and eventually we want to set the opacity for the modal box to 1 and also push it back down to its original position by setting translate y to 0. And doing the exact opposite for the fade out up animation, we start with opacity 1 and translate y 0, and end up with opacity 0 and translate y minus 3 rem. Okay, let's see what we've created. Indeed, on entrance, modal box fades in and slides down, and on exit it fades out and slides up. I suppose alternatively we could simply slide down and up the modal box without changing opacity, so let's try this and see how it looks. It's a subtle difference, maybe this way is a bit better. And guys, feel free to experiment and use your imagination and creativity in order to come up with awesome modal entrance and exit animations. Okay, let's restore the change in opacity, and I would like to keep the entrance animation for the modal box a bit shorter to 0.3 seconds. And now regarding the fade in and fade out animations over the modal element, which also includes the background overlay, let's keep them really short, 0.1 seconds. So for example, the fade in animation will be completed in 0.1 seconds, and the fade in down animation of the modal box will continue for 0.2 more seconds, in total 0.3. And regarding the fade out animation, let's not forget to add a small delay of 0.1 seconds so that we allow the modal box fade out up animation to take place before the modal is hidden. Okay, before checking the final result, let's do some tidying by gathering all animations and keeping them together towards the end of the file. Nice. And by the way, 50% width for modal content would be better, I think. And let's check the final result. Okay, let's leave it here. Now, one last thing I would like to discuss is the case where we have more than one modals in our page, and there is actually a very good chance we will. So let's move back to our HTML file and create two more modals. For this purpose, I will copy paste the first modal two more times, simply changing the title in order to distinguish them to modal title 1, 2, and 3. And let's also create two more modal triggering buttons and change the text to show modal 1, 2, and 3. Now we somehow want to link the triggering buttons to the corresponding modals. For example, we want to know that by clicking on the first button, this modal will be triggered. For this purpose, we will first specify IDs for the modals using the ID attribute, and let's set the ID for the first modal to modal 1, for the second modal to modal 2, and for the third modal to modal 3. And in order to specify to which modal each button refers to, we will use a data attribute, and let's call the attribute data modal target and set its value to the ID of the corresponding modal. For example, if we want this button to trigger this modal, the modal with ID modal 1, then this should be the value we should set its modal target attribute to. So by clicking this button, we will use JavaScript in order to extract the value of the data modal target attribute and trigger the corresponding modal. Similarly, we want this button to target the modal with ID modal 2 and this button to target the modal with ID modal 3. Okay, that's all with HTML, and now let's move back to JavaScript and do the necessary modifications. For starters, we now want to select all modal trigger buttons and modals and modal close buttons by using the query selector all method, which returns a node list containing all documents elements that match the specified selectors. Regarding the modal trigger buttons, instead of using the button selector, we could be a bit more specific, and for this purpose we could make use of the data modal target attribute. So by using this selector, we are selecting all elements in the document which have the data modal target attribute. Next step is to add event listeners to the elements. So starting with modal trigger buttons, we will use the for each method in order to go through each element in the node list. In this case, each element represents a modal trigger button, and for each modal trigger button, we want to add this click event listener. So let me cut this part, paste it in here, and replace the modal trigger button with lm. We will return to the toggle modal function call in a bit, but let's first quickly do the same for modal close buttons and modals. Now, regarding the toggle modal function, we now have to specify which modal we want to toggle since we have more than one modals. For this purpose, we will add a parameter to the function, and let's call the parameter modal ID. So the ID string of the modal will be passed into the function as an argument when it is called, And now the only modification we have to do in order for this to work is to get the specific modal using the ID. And for this purpose we can make use of the getElementById method and store it into a variable called modal. And that's all. We are done with the toggle modal function. All that remains now is to pass the modal ID as an argument when the function is called. In order to get the modal ID when a modal trigger button is clicked, we have to access its data modal target attribute value. So let's use event.currentTarget, although in the case of this button, current target and target will always coincide since it doesn't contain any other elements, and we will make use of the getAttribute method in order to get the value of the data modal target attribute. Next, when a modal close button is clicked, we want to access the ID of the modal it belongs to. And one way to do this is by using the closest method over the clicked close button. In here goes the selector. We are looking for the closest modal, and we want to extract the ID property value. And finally, on a click event over a modal, in this case we are specifically targeting an event over the modal backdrop, we can directly access its ID. Okay, let's check the result. And let's open modal 3. Nice. And modal 2. Works like a charm. And let's see if we get any errors in the console. No errors. Nice. One last thing you might want to add is the possibility for the user to dismiss or close the modal when they press a specific key on the keyboard, for example the escape key. So let's quickly do this. We first need to add an event listener over the document for the key down event. And if the escape key was pressed, in other words, if event.keycode equals to 27, but before closing the modal, we also want to make sure that the modal is currently open. One way to do this is by checking whether an element with the class modal combined with the class modal show exists. If this does not exist, it will be set to null, and therefore this expression will be false. And all we have to do now in order to close the open modal is call the toggle modal function, passing its ID as an argument. Notice that in order for this to work as intended, we assume only one modal window open at a time, which is a reasonable assumption since I don't think that more than one modals open at the same time would be a good user experience. Okay, let's check if this works. By opening a modal and pressing various keyboard keys, nothing happens, but if I hit escape, indeed modal goes away, and if I keep pressing escape while no modal is open, nothing seems to be happening. Also no errors in the console, so I think we are good. And let's not expand any further, guys. I hope by now you feel confident enough to go ahead and create all sorts of modals according to your style and needs. Based on this project, I've also created a few more modal examples, mainly just by tweaking the modal CSS styling and maybe the entrance and exit animations. I didn't change anything regarding the JavaScript part though. I will of course include a link in the description to this project as well. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video and got some value out of it. If you did, please hit the like button and feel free to share the video with anyone who might be interested. I would also love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more. Till next time, keep coding, keep improving, and enjoy the journey. Take care. Bye.